Ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to invite Lilianne Fan, co-founder and director of Geutanyoe Malaysia, to deliver the closing speech. Lilianne, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Ideas, to Trisha, to Ira, and the entire team for inviting me to this conference, and particularly for giving me the honor to give some closing remarks or share some reflections. I think what I'd like to do is to try to bring our perspective a little bit more to the region, because I believe the discussions today have mainly been about Malaysia. And while that is extremely important, I also think it's important for us to realize that a lot of the challenges and the issues that we're facing around issues of belonging, identity, exclusion, inclusion, these are not issues which are unique only to Malaysia. There is obviously uniqueness in the context, but it's also very important for us to understand some of these dynamics of why we see so many problematic dynamics when we talk about identity, belonging, exclusion, particularly in the context of statelessness and displacement. So I think, first of all, what I'd like to do is to have us think through the themes of identity, citizenship, belonging, inclusion, and exclusion as problems that are both modern political problems or modern political issues, but also issues that are deeply rooted in history, as well as the cultural shaping of personal, subjective, as well as collective memory. And there are tensions within those processes. If you're looking at the issues of statelessness and displacement, I think very often many of us who are practitioners or, in think tanks, looking at these issues, we'll look at it from a policy lens, or we'll look at it from a lens which is, sort of looking at legal, rights, perhaps, what are the rights that everybody should have and how those rights are granted or not granted. Or we look at it from a very personal way of, the types of identities that we feel and how those are not being recognized by certain powers or institutions. It's important, though, for us to remember that a lot of the institutionalization of identity in not just our region, but I'll focus on Southeast Asia, is really one that's been shaped through the legacies of history. And when I say the legacies of history, I mean colonialism, but even before colonialism, right? The different types of forms of political power that have historically shaped how communities, individuals, and political subjects belong to a particular entity. And this is important because, if you just look at the contemporary picture of Malaysia or Southeast Asia, you don't really understand how things came to be the way they are unless you look at history. So I think this is really important. I wasn't here for Yang Amat Mulia Tengku Zain's speech, but I'm very sure he must have touched on history as well, as he always does. But the reason for that is because it's very important. We cannot really understand where we are now unless we actually look at that. If we're looking at Malaysia, Malaysia is, like most countries in the region, not all, a post-colonial country. The whole region has been shaped by colonialism. And why is that important still? We're independent now, but why do people keep talking about post-colonialism? The reason it's important, especially for this issue about identity and belonging, is because it was through that history that legal identities were inscribed, right? Legal identities. And it's not something that happened after Merdeka. It's actually something that happened during colonialism, right? So if you look at pre-colonial or even early colonial periods, let's say in Malaysia, but also in India, and also in Burma, which then became part of India or was annexed to British India, in the East Indies, which is now Indonesia. In all of these polities, you have had a huge diversity of identities, of senses of belonging, of individuals and communities that had very fluid relationships with each other and very particular shifting relationships with each other as well, and also identities which were never exclusive, right? So that you had identities that always overlapped with each other, and one identity didn't necessarily exclude another one. For example, I don't know how many of you know this, but the Orang Asli, back in the day of pre-colonial times, under the courts, the Malay courts, were actually subjects of the court. So therefore, many were considered Melayu at the time because the word Melayu actually only meant to be a subject of the court, right? I think now, if we look at the current lens, we have these very kind of distinct categories, you're this, you're this, you're this. And actually, I think if most of us start to question them, we don't really fit into them, do we? I mean, all of us has a history from your family that that your family had a very diverse history. Parents migrated from here, grandparents migrated from wherever. So much more rich, so much richer, and so much more diverse than these little boxes that you have to tick, right? That's not just in Malaysia, that's also in other countries as well. If we're looking in the region, Myanmar is a very good example of this, where that kind of exclusion has become so extreme to the point where certain groups have been completely excluded from citizenship. And in this case of Myanmar, I'm talking about the Rohingya people, but also other minorities within Myanmar facing a completely unequal form of citizenship. And, there was a very stratified, form of citizenship that you have in Myanmar, which really excludes ethnic minorities, even who are citizens, from very basic rights, and makes it very difficult for people to get basic documentation. I think you've heard from some of the speakers today as well about problems of statelessness. Problems of statelessness are actually quite endemic to our region. They've spread very far, and they're very distinct in many ways. It's something that, challenges many of our countries within the region of Southeast Asia. And why is that? Partly because borders, right? The whole theme of this conference has been about borders. The border issue has been one which is always problematic, also because borders have been very much defined by power, right? There's no natural border. I think this is really important. If you're talking about political borders, there's no natural political border. The natural borders are the ones you have from ecology, from the environment. But anything which is made by man, by human beings, that's a political border. And politics shifts. Politics is not static. And therefore, borders also shift because power shifts. And this is really critical. So at what point in time does a border become fixed, right? Now in post-colonial times, we tend to imagine that borders are fixed. We tend to imagine that we have this snapshot which, there's a very absolute kind of truth and reality. But if you look just not very long ago, parts of Thailand were under kingdoms that were part of what is today in Malaysia. There was a lot of fluidity, right? There were parts of what is today Malaysia that were part of the kingdoms of Majapahit or, other polities. If you look at Thailand-Burma, for example, the Thai-Burma border, I've been going to Chiang Mai quite a lot recently, and you see Burmese writing on the old temples because it used to be part of the old kingdoms, right, which are today part of Burma. Today, Chiang Mai is part of Thailand, but there was a whole Lana kingdom. Lana was under some of the old Buddhist and Burmese kingdoms as well. So that kind of fluidity. The point is that once you start to have the institutionalization of a certain kind of fixed identity, whether it's Myanmar 1982 citizenship law, which had a very clear list of 135 ethnic nationalities who were recognized, and others basically who fell out of that category not being recognized, or if it's our own reality in Malaysia where we have this, perfect image of who Malaysians are, and most Malaysians don't necessarily fit into that. We are comfortable with it because everyone's used to seeing Chinese, Indian, Malay, and then the ethnic minorities. But truly to ask you, especially the young people in this room, how many of you really feel that your first identity is your ethnicity? Probably not that many, right? I mean, aren't there other things about your identity which you feel are so much more important? Like if anybody asked you, what defines you? What actually defines you? What do you think it is? What do you value about yourself the most? Is it your education? Is it your values? Is it your principles? Is it your ambitions? Is it your dreams? Is it the fact that you share a diverse sense of the world because we live in a country like Malaysia? So I think it's important, especially for young people, to have this sense, because I think many people in the young generation may not necessarily have access all the time to learn that entire history. And sometimes it's very important for us to keep understanding that history has to be not just understood, but questioned, right? There's official history and there's unofficial history, and there's fluidity in all of these things. And in the end, we're all going to be, members of societies or nation states or communities which will try to define us. But in the end, it's really important for us to remember that that definition, which comes from above, doesn't actually define who we are, right? The problem, though, is that it does actually limit people. It actually does have a very objective impact on the way people live. So there's an irony, because on the one hand, you know that, or hopefully we know or recognize, that we shouldn't be valuing things like ethnicity or ethnic identity as the main identities of our, of our being. We actually shouldn't have to do that. However, in societies where the only way that you can access rights is to get that kind of recognition, this is part of the challenge. Malaysia is one country where we have to have a clear identity, and if you don't have clarity of even birth registration or anything like this, you don't have those documentation, or the documentation gets very, very difficult, and it can lead to an exclusion of an entire, generation or so many individuals and entire communities. The same with the situation in Myanmar. Myanmar is a country where, because of the discriminatory citizenship law, which then has also encouraged or been reinforced by an extremely violent military that basically has shaped an education system which promotes that exclusion, right? You actually have entire communities who have been excluded from citizenship. Even those who have citizenship have been excluded from extremely basic rights. And now, of course, you have a situation where the civil war, you can see a military actually really, preying on its own people, civilians of all ethnicities in Myanmar. So how do we face these kinds of challenges? And I think it's important to remember the words of some great thinkers who actually have, studied these. And one I will mention is Benedict Anderson. If he hasn't been mentioned before, I hope many of you have read him. But Benedict Anderson was a great historian and political scientist of Southeast Asia, really. He was fluent in Bahasa, fluent in Tagalog, and fluent in many different languages. And he wrote really about communities as being imagined communities, right? And this whole concept of a community being something that you imagine, it's constructed. It's not a natural entity. And there's a whole, range of effort and work that needs to be done to shape that understanding of who is within your community. The other one I'll mention is Edward Said. And I think with all of the attention on Palestine and the horrors that are happening there, I hope that we will remember Edward Said, who was a Palestinian Christian who later went to the United States and became one of the biggest advocates for Palestinian rights. I had the privilege of studying at Columbia University when Edward Said was still alive. And his analysis of how, the other, right, is constructed, that is something which I hope all of you will start to revisit as well. Because it will help your work, whatever work you're involved in, whether you're working on statelessness, whether you're working on refugees, to understand that the other is something that's constructed and reinforced, whether that's reinforced by institutions, whether it's reinforced by media, the narratives. I think we heard just now as well on one of the panels from activists really working in the media side of things and challenging narratives. These are the types of things which we need to be challenging, and we need to be able to theorize it a little bit so we don't just see that these are only things happening in Malaysia. They're actually happening everywhere. The third intellectual who I'd like to highlight, who I hope will also perhaps be useful to some of you in the work, was my own supervisor when I was doing my master's at Columbia University. And that's Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who is still a great intellectual, mainly on political identity. And what he has worked on, he worked actually on an entire project, whole body of work, which led to an understanding of how colonialism shaped political identity. And he has a book, quite a small book, in addition to his larger works, called Define and Rule. And that is how defining groups of people and categories and legalizing them and codifying those identities actually was a form of rule. And that is, I think, something which, if in a post-colonial, state, post-colonial society, and if we're really thinking about, this is a liberalism conference, if we're thinking actually about being merdeka or being, and for Myanmar, thinking about the revolution, right? What are you throwing off? What are you actually trying to work to liberate yourself from, right? Is it not those old colonial concepts or these old Enlightenment concepts that we're trying to work against? So therefore, the work actually of liberation and revolution has to go further. It's not just political in the sense of, getting direct political independence. We've had that in Malaysia for quite a few years now. But where are we in terms of really being able to also free ourselves of old institutional definitions that actually may do more harm than good? So those are things that I would hope that especially the young professionals and young scholars and activists in the room will take forward in your own work. I think one thing that I'd like to say, just in closing, is that, when you start to value people based on who they are regardless of their ethnicity, their citizenship, their culture, and everything else, and you start practicing that, taking the labels off. And this is a difficult thing because I work with refugees and, basically besides myself and a couple of others in the team, my entire team are refugees. But there's so much more than that. And, even to call them refugees is actually quite a painful thing because that's not who they are. Saying that somebody is a refugee doesn't define who they are. We have incredibly talented, hardworking young people in our team from every background. The Malaysians in my team are amazing as well. But the people who come from very diverse backgrounds, we have Myanmar, Syria, we used to have Afghanistan, Yemen, and many others. They come from such histories and backgrounds that I've learned so much from, right? I mean, even myself, who's been in the humanitarian field since the beginning of my career, I think I've learned more from my own team here, this, small team of young people who are from different conflict areas than I have throughout my entire career, and definitely more than anything I learned in university, although I loved my university education as well. But that's where you really learn from. And I think the first trick to that is taking off those labels and really challenging yourself to see people as equal, even if they don't have the rights, even if they don't have citizenship, even if they may have enormous challenges. That practice of seeing people and relating to people with absolute equality, that I think is something that we should all challenge ourselves to do. Because even I catch myself sometimes. I catch myself, after all these years, still sometimes having not even conscious prejudice or, discrimination of any intentional kind. But I do catch myself sometimes thinking, oh, I really never saw it that way. I really never thought about this. You have to be able to be critical of, yourself and the way that each of us has been raised to assume differences and to be normalized and comfortable with differences. Of course, there's difference, and everybody, that's part of the beauty. There's diversity. But I think that recognizing that, it's not about diversity. It's about the differences that people are placed in, not of their own intention and not because of anything inherent to them, nothing because that they actually have less value, but because of a situation that has been placed on them or laws that have been placed on them that put them in a more difficult situation. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat people as equal. So I would like to close really just with that, to challenge all of us in our everyday lives. Maybe it will take us years to change, laws and actually be able to have, the full rights for persons who are stateless in this country. Maybe it will take us years to get citizenship for our Rohingya brothers and sisters in Myanmar. These are all things which we have to be working towards, but I think that each of us, even in those long, with those big challenges ahead of us, we can do so much in our everyday lives, each and every one of you. So I'd like to close on that and really think about helping us, through everything that we've heard today from so many wonderful thinkers and speakers and practitioners and activists. What can each of you do? What can each of you do in your everyday lives to start to challenge, those sometimes invisible prejudices that you may have, in your own life? Thank you.